programs, and welcome to another episode of Unrepentant Geeking, the show on that guy with the glasses that has seen things you wouldn't believe. But enough about my mental trauma and madness. I'm your host, Sean Carterfeld, and on today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at the first episode of Sailor Moon Crystal and the latest Doctor Who tie-in novel, Tales of Trenzalore. So, with that said, let's start things off with the girl who's always fighting evil by moonlight and winning love by daylight, the one named Sailor Moon. Hard as it may be to believe for those of us who grew up with the series, 2 years ago marked the 20th anniversary of Sailor Moon, and last week saw the culmination of a project that began back then with the release of the first episode of a new animated series titled Pretty Guardian Sailor Moon Crystal. While it's a potentially exciting time for all fans of this groundbreaking franchise, for lovers of the manga side of Sailor Moon in particular, Crystal represents the realization of a long-held dream. To understand what I mean, we must go back to December 1991, when the Sailor Moon manga first began monthly publication in the manga anthology Nakayoshi, via chapters that usually measured around 30 to 40 pages in length. The series quickly became a smash hit, to the point that by March of 1992, a weekly animated adaptation of Sailor Moon arrived on TVs in Japan. And since the nature of animation in general means a single episode of a standard-length half-hour show could easily cram 1 or even 2 chapters of a manga into its runtime if so desired, clearly epic levels of padding and filler were going to be needed. So, whereas the series' initial Dark Kingdom story arc lasted for 12 chapters in the manga, over in the anime, the same storyline was stretched out across a whopping 46 episodes, starting a trend that, when all was said and done, would lead to a 52-chapter manga becoming a 200-episode anime. On top of that, the anime also began making outright changes that went deeper than just the usual one-off filler episodes, including the introduction of major new characters, enemies, powers, and even in some cases, whole story arcs. Take the anime version of the Dark Kingdom arc, where the antagonist subgroup known as the Four Generals were given significantly increased screen time in comparison to their role in the manga, and as a result, ended up with tweaked and altered personalities in order to accommodate their larger roles. In particular, the character of Nephrite went through an entire character arc and romantic subplot in the anime that would culminate in a dramatic sacrifice to save his new love, and all of which helped make the character a fan favorite among anime watchers. Except all of that was completely absent in the manga, where Nephrite was presented as just another fairly personality-free enemy among a crowd of many. Over time, the differences between the anime and the manga became more and more pronounced, to the point that the anime began making wholesale changes to major plot developments in the manga, and going so far as to have an ultimate finale that differed greatly in tone and execution from the manga's conclusion. As you can imagine, which version of Sailor Moon is ultimately superior has long been a contentious topic of debate among some of the franchise's fanbase. Although trolls from both sides have been known to freely team up in order to beat up on the 2003 live-action Sailor Moon TV series, which made even more dramatic changes than the first anime, but that's a whole other kettle of fish. with some manga fans even going so far as to bemoan the anime as one giant missed opportunity. Enter Sailor Moon Crystal, a 26-episode anime which has been pitched as a reboot that stands wholly separate from the original anime series and promises to hew more closely to the manga instead. Crystal begins, naturally enough, with the Dark Kingdom storyline, but while it will be 20 episodes shorter than the original anime's run, there will still be enough episodes of the show that filler of some kind seemingly will still be needed. Or I suppose it's always possible they might try and adapt the popular second Sailor Moon storyline that among other things introduced Chibi Yusa to the series, and itself only ran for 10 chapters in the manga. Still, if that's the plan, then the people in charge of Crystal are doing an excellent job of keeping mum about it, including preventing any voice casting announcements for characters outside the Dark Kingdom arc from being released. Still, all of that lies ahead in the future. What matters now is that the first episode of Crystal has premiered, and at last we can tell just how big a departure it will be from the first anime, right? Well, yes and no. Here's the thing. While the first Sailor Moon anime did indeed end up taking major liberties from the manga over the course of its run, in point of fact, the first episode of that series was a damn near perfect recreation of the first chapter of the manga. It was only afterwards when the series began going its own way, such as how, for example, the following 7 episodes consisted entirely of filler featuring Sailor Moon operating on her own before finally introducing Sailor Mercury, something the manga did in its second chapter. This means Sailor Moon Episode 1, The Crybaby, Usagi's Beautiful Transformation, and Sailor Moon Crystal Episode 1, Usagi, Sailor Moon, are far more similar than later episodes clearly will be. That being said, there are some clear differences between the two which it can be instructive to examine. First and foremost, the number one difference between the two episodes is the animation, and not just because of the age of the original anime either. As previously stated, the original Sailor Moon anime was produced on the Quick, and was also airing weekly, and its visual quality definitely reflects this. This is not to say it was a bad-looking show, but even in this first episode, the usage of what will clearly be stock footage in terms of attacks, transformations, and other elements is obvious. Crystal, meanwhile, has had a significantly longer production time than its predecessor, and will be airing twice a month as opposed to a weekly schedule as well. I also suspect its lower episode count and nature as something of a prestige project means it has a higher budget per episode as well, because frankly, the animation in this episode is dynamic, clean, and filled with gorgeous details and small touches. Nowhere is this truer than in Crystal's take on the iconic Sailor transformation, and put simply, the quality of animation in at least this first episode is about as good as TV animation gets, and it gives the show a lush feel that well suits its new character designs. Speaking of those character designs, this is the area of Crystal that will likely be most divisive among viewers initially, particularly those more familiar with the original anime. A clear effort has been taken to bring the look of the characters, especially regarding their faces, more in line with the art style of the manga, and the change may take some getting used to. Certainly when I saw the first few trailers for Crystal, I found the new look to be a bit distracting, but once I actually started watching the first episode and saw everything in its proper context, I quickly forgot any such concerns and was able to simply enjoy the show on its own terms. I suspect the same will be true for most other viewers as well, especially once it becomes clear that Crystal has not abandoned the sense of humor that so often was the hallmark of the original Sailor Moon anime. Beyond the animation itself, the biggest changes in Crystal's first episode from the original centers around Usagi and Mamoru's interaction, which is played more explicitly as a romantic encounter, and a greater presence for the character of Sailor V. The former also ties into another new addition to Crystal, namely an opening dream sequence that leads into a lovely bit of comedy that in itself leads to the series' rocking new opening credits, and which altogether helps set the stage for Sailor Moon Crystal with some real style and panache, while hinting for newcomers at the epic events yet to come. As for Sailor V, while the character did have cameos of sorts in the original animes thanks to some video games, her actual role in the universe of Sailor Moon was kept fairly oblique until near the end of that show's run. Not so in Crystal, where several characters end up referring to Sailor V outright over the course of the first episode as a real figure already engaged in the fight against evil. It also helps lead to a lovely small touch where it's Usagi who names herself Sailor Moon. It's a little thing I know, but it helps give the character a greater sense of agency, something the original anime often struggled with. It'll be interesting to see if and how all these small changes end up playing out down the line. And indeed, overall, the first episode of Sailor Moon Crystal stands as a strong start for the series. Said episode even ends with a quick tease of many a Sailor Moon fan's favorite character, Amy, aka Sailor Mercury, who will be getting her full introduction in episode 2 on July 19th. At the end of the day, this first episode does not stray far from the familiar, and indeed, those who might have been wondering if this new series might overly indulge in modern references can rest easy for now at least. The arcade is still an arcade. If you're interested in checking out the first episode of Pretty Guardian Sailor Moon Crystal, be sure to head over to sites such as Hulu or Crunchyroll for the official subtitled release, and please don't go with pirated versions on YouTube or the like. Instead, support the proper release of a show that's gotten off to a great start, and hopefully presages another long-lasting, miraculous Moonlight romance. For those of you who are curious, I'm planning to check back in with Sailor Moon Crystal after the 4th episode, which should air around mid-August. By then, we should have a better idea, hopefully, of the pacing the show is going to choose, and maybe even figure out if it's going to just be the Dark Kingdom storyline or something else. So, that's something hopefully you'll look forward to.
And now it's time for one last bow. Like all your other selves, 11's hour is over now. The clock is striking 12's.
The siege of Trenzalore is now begun.
The Time Lord has entered the trap.
Help him change the future. Do it!
The Doctor is regenerating! If you want my life, come and get it!
I couldn't tell you why, but I've always been attracted to the idea of adventures or tales embedded into a larger story. So, for example, say you have a book where there's a jump in time of a couple years, and it's made clear that the characters have been off having adventures in the interim. Or say there's a TV show that ends its season with the characters trapped in an unusual locale or situation, and when you come back in the fall, all sorts of off-screen and different from the norm shenanigans have gone by. The thought of what those unseen adventures must have been like is an irresistible lure to me, even if, again, I can't explain why it lights the fuse of my imagination in the way they do. So it should come as no surprise how much I love it when we, the audience, are given a chance to go back and view even just some of the events that have previously occurred away from our ever-watchful eyes. This is where ancillary tie-in material, or as it's more commonly known these days, an expanded universe, can really come into its own, and indeed, one of my all-time favorite sci-fi properties, Doctor Who, was seemingly almost tailor-made for just such creations. Before we go any further, keep in mind there will be major spoilers for the most recent episode of the Doctor Who TV series, The Time of the Doctor. So if you have yet to see that particular episode, then be it on your own head should you continue forward. One of the big plot points for The Time of the Doctor was the idea that after arriving at last on the planet Trenzalore, a place that in the course of a previous adventure, the 11th Doctor and his companion Clara had learned would be the planet where the Doctor would finally meet his ultimate end, the Doctor ended up becoming the protector of the snowy town of Christmas in order to both keep the inhabitants of said town alive and to guard a most unusual crack located within the town that would be the key to restoring the Doctor's long-presumed dead people, the Time Lords, back to the universe at large. All the Doctor had to do was say his name, but in the process he would start another time war, and the last time there was one of those, the universe itself barely survived. With that in mind, species and empires from all over the galaxy gathered around Trenzalore with the intent of destroying the crack and Christmas in the process. But the presence of both an anti-technology field and the Doctor himself turned the whole situation into one giant stalemate that would go on to last for over 900 years. In the course of The Time of the Doctor, we get only the briefest glances at the various struggles and confrontations that he would be involved with during that 900-year period when many an infamous villain made efforts both big and small to destroy Christmas, kill the Doctor, or even force him to say his name and thus trigger the next Time War. Enter the just-released anthology Doctor Who Tales of Trenzalore, which includes 4 new short stories set at different points in the 900-year siege of Trenzalore, and features such classic Who foes as the Ice Warriors, the Autons, and even a couple more obscure figures from Who lore that will no doubt be welcome returnees for old-school Whovians. One of the most interesting aspects of Tales of Trenzalore is how it features a Doctor stripped of almost all his usual tricks, save for his trusty sonic screwdriver. Gone is the TARDIS, and with it the Doctor's ability to flit out across all of time and space, and, among other things, leave his problems behind. Instead, he's forced at last to go the long way, as it were, and see firsthand the impact for good and ill his choices have on the universe around him. It makes for some fascinating character moments throughout Tales, especially during the latter two stories of the anthology, where the Doctor was also content with the combination of his aging body, the last story in particular is set around 700 years into the siege, at which point the Doctor has become older physically than even his legendary crotchety first incarnation, and the loss of a leg. These developments force the Doctor to change up his normal approach, and in particular he becomes increasingly reliant on direct help from the townspeople of Christmas. Of course, the Doctor always has had his companions, but in Tales, this trope takes on a different tact, and both the inevitable loss of life that occurs despite his best efforts, and the fact that he knows Trenzalore's ultimate fate will be a grim one, noticeably takes their toll on the Doctor. It's also fascinating to see the Doctor's opponents have to deal with some of the same limitations that he himself faces thanks to Trenzalore's anti-technology field. And I always say that a clever and resourceful villain is a good villain. It gives their threat more weight, which in turn makes the Doctor's victories all the more satisfying. Indeed, that's the word I would use to describe Tales of Trenzalore as a whole, satisfying. No, the stories in the collection are not going to change the world of Doctor Who forever, or any such nonsense, but then that's not what they're trying to do. It's clear the mandate for Tales was to tell fun Doctor Who stories that walk just a little bit off the beaten path, while still ultimately keeping enough of the Who formula to be recognizable. Frankly, I had so much fun with this collection that I hope we may even get a full novel set on Trenzalore someday. Perhaps, for example, one that follows a particular family and their interactions with the Doctor across several generations, all while dealing with a reoccurring enemy that refuses to go down for good. Or maybe we could flip the switch and see what the siege was like from the many alien races that hovered around Trenzalore for 9 centuries. Regardless, Tales of Trenzalore is the perfect, inexpensive treat for Doctor Who fans looking to get a fix to hold them over until the series returns on August 23rd, or for those just looking for one last run with 11 before the hour of 12 begins. And that's it for another edition of Unrepentant Geeking. I hope you all enjoyed watching the show as much as I enjoyed making it. By this point, I imagine you've noticed that I'm actually doing video intros and outros. Yeah, I've gotten some requests to do so from some of my audience, and I'm going to give it a try. Please, while I figure out how to make this all work, forgive any sloppiness or mistakes or just whatever. I'm not really used to working with video that much. I'm going to hopefully improve as we go along. I'm not going to do this for everything, certainly not for Thumb Wars, because it wouldn't particularly work. Let's just say that. But I certainly will do it for Unrepentant Geeking and maybe even Blistered Reviews as well. If you love it, if you hate it, if you don't care, regardless, let me know what you think of these video intros, outros, and if you want to see more video from me, or if you're okay with me just sticking with audio. You're my audience, and I am going to listen to you. Meanwhile, we'll hopefully see you back here this Saturday for a new Thumb Wars that'll be taking a look at the world, that'll be taking a look at some of the forgotten gems of the video game world. Until then, for Thumb Wars, Unrepentant Geeking, and That Guy with the Glasses, I'm Sean Cronenfeld, wishing all of you happy geeking. See ya!